They told me the viewport was an improvement. 6 inches across, roughly circular, though the edges weren't even where someone had cut the whole plate by hand and hadn't even bothered to file it smooth. The glass, if it was glass, it felt more like resin when I touched it, was maybe a 1/4 inch thick and already clouded. Not scratched, clouded, like cataracts. Like the submarine itself had been staring into the dark for so long that its eye had started to go milky. Through it, I could see almost nothing, a dim reddish murk, the faintest gradient between what might have been up and what might have been down. If I pressed my face close enough that my breath fogged the surface, I could sometimes make out movement, shifts in the darkness, something denser passing through something less dense. But it was like trying to read through a glass of wine. You knew there was something on the other side. You just couldn't prove it. The technician who installed it seemed proud. He tapped the resin with his knuckle before they closed the hatch and said, almost cheerfully, "More than the last crew got." Then, they welded me in. And the viewport became the only part of the outside world I was allowed to see. And it showed me nothing I could use and everything I was afraid of. My name's Jacob Harlow, prisoner 1471, under the Consolidation of Irons Conviction Realization Program. If you haven't heard of that term, I envy you. It means the COI decides your crime is best repaid through service. The kind of service no volunteer would agree to, and no employee would survive. They dress it up with the language of rehabilitation, contribution to the collective, a chance to earn your freedom. What it actually means is they needed a body, and I was available. My crime was minor. Theft of ration supplements during the shortage after Filament Station went dark. 200 calories worth of protein paste that I'd taken from my daughter, who was 7, and losing weight in a way that made her cheekbones look like they belonged on a different, older face. The tribunal took 4 minutes. I remember because the woman beside me was convicted of assault, and hers took 3. They gave us the same sentence. The submarine was designated SM-14, 4th in the series. Same unofficial name as all the others, the Iron Lung. The COI had built it from station scraps, same as its predecessors. But this one was bound for a different ocean, not AT-5, where the SM-8 and SM-13 had been sent and torn apart. This time, they were sending me to Z-8. Z-8 was the second blood ocean under COI jurisdiction, smaller than AT-5, colder according to the orbital readings. The moon itself was farther out, caught in a slow orbit around nothing anyone could see anymore. The body it had once circled was gone, taken in the quiet rapture, along with everything else. And now, Z-8 just drifted. A frozen rock with an impossible ocean of human blood pooled in its deepest crater, surrounded by vacuum and starless dark. 2 submarines had been sent to Z-8 before me, the SM-10 and the SM-12. Neither had returned. The briefing officer, a thin man with a clipboard who spoke like he was reading someone else's grocery list, told me the missions were classified and inconclusive. Equipment failure, probably. Communications loss. He used the word probably 3 times in 2 minutes. I counted. He said the SM-14 had been approved. Better hull reinforcement. Better oxygen recycling. The viewport. He mentioned the viewport like it was a luxury. A concession. A kindness. He gave me a map. 9 coordinate markers this time. A camera mounted to the exterior hull. Same grainy, low-resolution system as the previous models. Photograph each point of interest. Document biological or geological structures. Return with usable data. Earn your freedom. He said that last part to the clipboard. The descent into Z-8's ocean was quieter than I expected. I'd braced for impact. Some kind of threshold moment. A splash, a shudder, the sensation of breaking through a surface. But the blood ocean on Z-8 didn't have a surface the way water does. The transition was almost imperceptible. In one moment, the hull was creaking against vacuum. The next, the creaking changed pitch, became lower, wetter, and the viewport went from black to a deep, arterial red. And then, the cold hit. Not inside the submarine. The interior temperature held. But I could feel it through the hull, through the floor, through the viewport when I made the mistake of resting my hand against it. Z8's ocean was cold. Not the cold of deep water. The cold of something that had never been warm. The cold that felt geological, permanent. Like the blood itself remembered being inside a living body and resented that it wasn't anymore. I watched the viewport during the descent because I could not watch it. The murk outside darkened by degrees as the depth reading climbed, red becoming deeper red, becoming something that wasn't really red anymore, just a thickness in the dark. The submarine's exterior light, a single weak bulb mounted beside the camera, cast a cone of dull amber that reached 6 feet into the blood before dissolving. Beyond that, nothing. Through the viewport, all I could see was a faint glow at the very edge of the light's reach, and past that, a blackness so complete it looked solid, like a wall. Like if I could reach through the glass and touch it, it would feel like something. I pulled my hand off the viewport and didn't touch it for a long time. Marker 1 was at the bottom of the crater, 312 meters. I pressed the camera shutter release and waited the 4 seconds for it to process. The image that appeared on the monitor was grainy, but legible. The ocean floor, dark, silt, fine-grained, undisturbed. A few pale shapes in the distance that could have been rocks or mineral deposits. The viewport, for its part, showed me the same dim amber cone dissolving into nothing. I logged the photograph and moved on. The submarine crawled forward at maybe 2 knots, slower than AT-5's missions, the briefing had noted, because Z8's ocean was denser, thicker. The motor strained harder here, and the sound it made was different, muffled and labored, like trying to speak through a wet cloth. Every few seconds, the coordinate display clicked forward. That click became the metronome of my world, the only proof I was going anywhere at all. Marker 2 was 12 minutes northeast. The photograph showed more slit, a gradual slope downward, and the first sign of something structural, a ridge of dark material rising from the floor in a line that was too straight to be natural. It ran from the bottom of the frame to the top and disappeared into the murk. Through the viewport, I caught the faintest suggestion of it, a vertical darkness, slightly darker than the darkness around it, like a crease in the black. I took a second photograph. The ridge was joined by another, parallel to the first, maybe 20 feet away. Between them, the slit was a different color, lighter, almost pink. I noted it in the log and moved on. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I was still in the part of the mission where I could pretend this was a routine. Marker 3 ended the pretending. The camera showed a field of ruins, not a single structure or scattered formation, a field, dozens of walls, columns, arched shapes that might have been doorways, all made of the same dark, smooth material as ridges, all rising from the silt at angles that suggested intention, architecture, design. Something had built these. Something had lived here, in the blood, in the cold, in the dark, at the bottom of a crater, on a moon that shouldn't exist. The proportions were wrong for humans. Doorways too narrow and too tall. Stairs, if they were stairs, with risers spaced for limbs longer than ours. I stared at the photograph, and I tried to imagine what would move comfortably through these spaces. Every shape my mind produced was something I didn't want to think about. But that wasn't what ended the pretending. Through the viewport, that useless clouded 6-inch circle of murky resin, I saw something on the ruins. A texture. A color that didn't match the dark architecture of the pale silt. Something reddish-pink, clinging to the surface of the nearest wall like moss on a stone. It appeared unevenly in organic branching patterns, and it reminded me of something I couldn't immediately place. I pressed the shutter. 4 seconds. The image resolved on the monitor. It was tissue. Human tissue. Living tissue. Or something that had once been living and hadn't received the message that it was supposed to stop. It grew across the ruins like a film, like a membrane, branching in vein-like patterns that followed the architecture's contours. In places it was thin and translucent, and I could see the dark stone beneath it. In others, it bunched and thickened into masses that looked disturbingly like organs. Not any organ I could name, but the texture was unmistakable. Wet, biological, human. I took another photograph. The branching patterns weren't random. They followed the shapes of circulatory systems, veins and arteries mapped onto stone, pulsing faintly in the camera's flash, like something with a heartbeat that had been stretched across an entire building. The SM-10, the SM-12, 2 submarines sent to Z-8. Crews never recovered, remains never found. I was looking at the remains. I almost stopped. I want to be honest about that. I almost turned the submarine around at marker 3 and pointed it toward the surface and let the COI do whatever they were going to do with me for abandoning the mission. But the math wouldn't let me. The oxygen recycler was rated for roughly 5 hours. The descent had taken 40 minutes. The return trip would take at least as long, probably longer, fighting the density of the blood. That left me enough air to complete the mission and surface with maybe 20 minutes of margin, or enough to turn back now and arrive at the top with an hour of oxygen and a failed mission and a tribunal that would put me in another submarine within a week. There was also my daughter. Conviction realization carried a promise. Complete the mission, earn your freedom, return to your family. I didn't believe the COI kept its promises as a rule, but I believe they might keep this one, because the alternative, admitting publicly that conviction realization was a death sentence, would make it harder to find the next volunteer. I pressed forward. Marker 4. More ruins. The tissue was everywhere now, covering the structure in translucent sheets that caught the submarine's light and shimmered faintly, like wet skin under fluorescent. Through the viewport, I could see it pulsing, a slow rhythmic contraction, maybe once every 10 seconds. The entire ruined field was breathing, not the way a single organism breathes, the way a system breathes, coordinated, distributed, like the tissue wasn't separate pieces, but one continuous thing laid across the architecture like a net. The camera confirmed what the viewpoint hinted at. In the photograph from marker 4, the tissue on the nearest wall had thickened into a mass, roughly the size of a human torso, and inside that mass, captured in the grainy gray red of the camera's image, there was a shape that looked like a face. Not a skull, not bone, a face. Skin and muscle in the closed ridge of an eyelid, frozen mid-expression, in something that might have been sleep, or might have been a scream that had been happening for so long, the muscles gave up and settled. I didn't take a second photograph of the face. The SM-10's pilot, or the SM-12's, taken apart and redistributed, spread across the ruins like something planted, like something cultivated. The ocean, or whatever lived in it, had disassembled them at a level I couldn't comprehend, and then reassembled their tissue into something useful, something that served a purpose that I wasn't equipped to understand. I thought about the briefing, biological structures detected by orbital scan. They'd known. The scans would have registered tissue, human tissue. The COI had looked at these readings and classified them as points of interest and sent me down to photograph them, and at no point had anyone said the biological structures were people. The ruins grew denser past marker 4, taller. The walls closed in around the submarine's path, and the viewport pressed near enough to the tissue-covered surfaces that I could see detail the camera couldn't capture. At marker 5, I passed through a narrow corridor, 2 walls close enough that the hole scraped against one, and the viewport filled completely with the reddish-pink membrane. For 3 or 4 seconds, my face was inches from it, separated by nothing but a 1/4 inch of clouded resin. I could see pores, hair follicles, the fine texture of human skin. It was magnified and stretched across stone like wallpaper, alive and warm and glistening in the amber light. I closed my eyes. I'm not ashamed of that. I closed my eyes and drove blind for 30 seconds, and when I opened them, the corridor was behind me, and the viewport showed only the familiar red-black nothing, and I could breathe again. At marker 6, the camera captured something different. The tissue on the ocean floor had organized itself into a pattern, not the vein-like branching I'd seen on the walls. This was geometric, concentric rings of living tissue radiating outward from a central point, each ring slightly thicker than the last. The whole formation, maybe 50 feet across, it looked like a target. It looked like a signal. It looked like something meant to be seen from above. And through the viewport, at the very edge of the light, I caught movement, something large displacing the blood in a way I could see as a shift in the murk, a thickening of the red. Then, it was there, and then gone. No sound, no impact against the hull, just presence and the absence, and the viewport staring back at me like a dead eye. The sound started at marker 7. I need to describe this carefully, because it's the part that matters the most, and the part that's hardest to explain. It wasn't a noise the way the motor was a noise, or the hull creaking was a noise. It was a pressure, a low subsonic vibration that I felt before I heard, registering first in my chest and my sinuses, in the backs of my eyes before resolving into something my ears could process. Deep, rhythmic, immensely slow, like a pulse, but with intervals of 15 or 20 seconds between each beat. The kind of heartbeat that belongs to something so large, its circulatory system operates on a geological timescale. The submarine vibrated with it. The viewport vibrated. The blood outside vibrated. And through the clouded resin, I could see the murk ripple with each pulse. Concentric rings of disturbance expanding outward from somewhere below me, somewhere deeper than the ruins, deeper than the crater floor, somewhere in the bedrock of the moon itself. It was down there, the thing they'd sent me to find, or the thing that had arranged for me to be sent, dormant, ancient, breathing at a frequency that made the entire ocean flex like a living membrane around it. I took the photograph at marker 7 and didn't look at it. I heard the camera process. I heard the monitor flicker. I kept my eyes on the viewport and my hands on the controls, and I drove toward marker 8 because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding, and I wasn't ready to understand. I looked at the photograph later. I wish I hadn't. It showed the ocean floor dropping away into a chasm. The ruins ended at its edge like a city built on a cliff, and below, in the darkness past the camera's reach, there was a shape. Not the whole thing, a section of something, a curve of pale, rigid flesh the size of a building, covered in formations I initially mistook for barnacles, before I realized they were closed mouths. Hundreds of them, each one large enough to fit a person inside, each one sealed shut, lips pressed together, patient. The flesh around them was old, not decayed, preserved, ancient in the way that stone is ancient, carrying the weight of time in its texture. Whatever this was, it had been here longer than the blood, longer than the moon, maybe longer than us. The tissue on the ruins made sense now. The creature wasn't eating the people the COI sent down. It was processing them, taking them apart and redistributing their material across its habitat, weaving human tissue into a system that served a function I couldn't name. The pilots of the SM-10 and SM-12 weren't dead. They were installed. I was close, not to the creature itself. I don't think you could get close to something that size. Not in any meaningful sense. Marker 8, the chasm's edge, the pulsing so strong now that the coordinate display flickered with each beat, and the camera produced images laced with static. Close to whatever it was paying attention with. I could feel it the way you feel someone watching you from across a room. Not a sound, not a movement, just a sudden, certain knowledge that something with a mind is aware of you and is deciding what you are. The viewport darkened, not gradually, all at once, as though something had passed between the submarine and its own light, The amber glow vanished and returned in the space of a single breath. Something immense had moved past me, close enough to block the light, not close enough to touch. It was looking at me. I could feel it in a way that I can't justify with instruments. The proximity sensors showed nothing. The depth reading was stable. The camera, when I pressed the shutter with a hand that shook badly enough to miss the button twice, showed only empty black ocean and the faintest pale suggestion at the absolute limit of resolution. But I knew, the way prey knows, the way something small and warm knows when something vast and cold has turned its attention toward it and is taking its measure. The pulsing stopped. For maybe 30 seconds, the ocean was completely silent. No vibration, no subsonic pressure, no heartbeat. Just the hum of my motor and the thin wheeze of the recycler, and my own breathing. Too fast, too shallow, filling the cabin with the sound of something afraid. And then the pulsing resumed, but different, slower, farther away, receding, like a tide pulling back. Through the viewport, the murk lightened, almost imperceptibly. The amber light reached a little farther into the blood. Whatever had been close was moving away, sinking back toward the chasm, back toward the deep place where it slept. And I understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in my chest that it had looked at me and decided I wasn't worth keeping, not worth processing, not worth distributing, not worth weaving into the system it was building from human tissue and ancient stone. It had examined me the way you examine a piece of fruit and find it wrong. Not rotten, exactly. Just not ripe, not suitable, not what was expected. And it had put me back. The rejection should have felt like a relief. It didn't. It felt like being told you don't matter by something older than your species. Like shouting into a canyon and hearing nothing coming back. Not even an echo. And I didn't care about any of it, because the only thought left in my head was a simple animal imperative. I didn't go to Marker 9. I turned the submarine around. The coordinate display ticked backward. The motor strained against the dense blood and the hull creaked, and the oxygen reading dropped into the yellow. Up. Go. Up. Get out. Break the surface and bang on the hatch until someone cuts you free, and then hold your daughter, and never go below anything again. The ascent took longer than the descent. The motor whined. The recycler coughed harder. Blood seeped through the viewport seal in a slow, warm trickle that pulled on the control panel and dripped onto my hands. Through the clouded resin, I watched the darkness thin by degrees, black to deep red, to a lighter red. That might have been my imagination, or might have been the ocean growing shallower. I didn't look at the photographs I'd taken. I didn't open the camera log. I sat with my hands on the controls and my eyes on the viewport, and I drove upward, and I thought about my daughter's face and the way she used to fall asleep with her hand wrapped around my thumb. The submarine broke the surface 47 minutes later. The viewport showed a change, the red murk replaced by a dim, grayish light filtering through the resin. Not sunlight. There was no sun. Just the ambient glow of the station's flood lamps on the gantry above. I hit the emergency signal. They retrieved me within the hour. When the hatch opened and the stable air of the station poured in, I cried. I'm not ashamed of that either. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. They sat me in a room with no windows. I noticed that. And 2 officers asked me questions from a list. What I'd seen at each marker. What the camera had captured. Whether I had encountered mechanical issues. Whether the viewport had been useful. They asked me about the viewport twice. I told them everything. The ruins, the tissue, the face in the wall, the concentric rings on the ocean floor, the chasm, the creature. I told them that it was ancient and enormous, and that it looked at me and turned away. I told them the previous crews hadn't been killed. They'd been taken apart and spread across the ruins like a living membrane, and they were still down there, still technically alive, woven into something that I couldn't understand. The officers wrote nothing down. I noticed that. They had tablets in front of them. They asked their questions and listened to my answers, and their hands never moved. They already knew. Everything I was telling them. Every detail I was struggling to articulate through the shaking and the exhaustion and the taste of recycled blood air still in my mouth. They already knew. The orbital scans had told them about the tissue, the SM-10's partial telemetry. I learned later it had transmitted data for 18 minutes before going silent, had told them about the ruins. They'd known what was down there before they built the SM-14, before they handed me the map and offered me my freedom. They hadn't sent me to take photographs. They'd sent me to be collected. And the creature had refused. The third hour was different. The two officers left. A woman I hadn't seen before entered the room and sat across from me and folded her hands on the table and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not sympathy, not cruelty, something clinical. The expression of someone calculating a variable. She asked me one question. In your assessment, is the entity still receptive to future deliveries? The word deliveries sat between us like a dropped knife. I didn't answer immediately. She didn't rush me. She sat there with her hands folded and waited the way someone waits when they have all the time in the world and you have none. She clarified, though she didn't need to. The COI had established what she called a maintenance protocol with the Blood Oceans. AT-5's entity was active, aggressive, territorial. It took what was sent, and in return, it remained in its ocean. The arrangement was reliable. Z8's entity was different, dormant, unresponsive to most stimuli. The SM-10 and SM-12 had been accepted, absorbed, processed, integrated. But the CIO wasn't certain the pattern would hold. They needed to know if the entity was still participating in the exchange. And I had come back, which meant either the entity was no longer accepting deliveries, and the maintenance protocol had failed, and the implications were catastrophic, or, and I could see this forming behind her eyes as she watched me, I had done something wrong, deviated from the route, failed to reach the correct depth, introduced a variable that disrupted the exchange. I told her the truth. I turned back at marker 8. The creature had examined me and withdrawn. I'd taken that as the clearest possible signal that I was not wanted. She nodded, wrote something on her tablet, the first person in 3 hours to write anything down. Then she told me I would not be earning my freedom, that the mission was incomplete. Conviction realization required completion of the assigned task. I would be returned to holding, pending reassignment. I asked about my daughter. She left the room without answering. They didn't put me in another sub. Not right away. I want to be clear about that because it matters for understanding what came next. I was in holding for 6 days, a cell slightly larger than the submarine, which was either irony or efficiency. They fed me, gave me water, didn't let me see my daughter or speak to anyone outside the holding block. On the 4th day, a guard I'd never spoken to slid a ration tray through the slot and said, without looking at me, "They're voting on it tomorrow." The COI is technically democratic. Citizens vote on major decisions, resource allocation, mission approval, conflict response. I'd always understood that the votes were real, that the numbers mattered, that the process was one of the few things separating us from the kind of authoritarianism that Eden represented. The vote concerned what to do about me, about the fact that the entity had rejected an offering, and the COI needed to determine whether the maintenance protocol could be restored before Z8's creature decided to stop being dormant. I don't know the exact count. I was told later it wasn't close. The station had 641 registered citizens. The measure passed by a margin of over 400. The resolution was worded carefully. I've had time to think about the wording, because someone read it to me, slowly, on the morning of the 7th day, and the language was precise, in the way language is precise when it needs to make something monstrous sound administrative. The rejected offering constitutes as a breach in the established exchange with the Z8 entity. To prevent the escalation and preserve the integrity of the maintenance protocol, the offering must be rendered complete by alternative means. The remains of prisoner 1471 will be delivered to the Z8 Ocean via unmanned descent within 72 hours of processing. Processing. They meant execution. They were going to kill me and send my body back down, finish the delivery the creature had declined to finish itself, because the system required it, because the math worked, because 641 people on a rusting station in a starless void had voted democratically to continue existing at the cost of one man who had stolen 200 calories of protein paste for his daughter, and I would have voted the same way. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. If it had been someone else's name on the resolution, someone I didn't know, some other convict with some other daughter and some other cell, I would have read the measure and thought about the numbers and voted yes. Because conviction realization is how we survive. Because the system needs bodies. And I'm glad, in the quiet and shameful core of myself, when the body isn't mine. Except this time, it is. I'm recording this on the submarine's terminal. They put me back in the SM-14 an hour ago. Not for a mission. There's no coordinates this time. No map. No camera assignment. They just needed a container that could survive the descent, and the iron lung was already built. The hatch is welded. The viewport's dark. The ocean's below me, cold and patient, and full of the people who came before me. Their tissue spread across ruins that were ancient when humanity was still learning to make fire. They haven't started the descent yet. I think they're waiting for something. A signal. An authorization. Or maybe they're just giving the creature time to notice that the offering's being returned. I kept looking at the viewport. That 6-inch circle of clouded resin that the technician was so proud of. It was more than the last crew got. I think about my daughter. I think about the face in the wall. I think about the vote. 400 people choosing correctly. Choosing the way I would have chosen. I wonder if the creature will take me this time. Whole, instead of alive. Whether my skin will be spread across some ancient doorway, and my closed eyes will stare into the dark for centuries, while the ocean pulses around me. The thing about an iron lung is that it breathes for you. You lie inside it, and it expands and contracts, and your chest rises and falls. And from the outside, it looks like living. But you're not choosing to breathe. The machine is choosing. You're just the body it needs to make the motion mean something. The submarine is descending now. I can feel the pressure changing. The viewport's going red. I'm pressing my hand against the glass. It's cold this time. Colder than before. Something is pressing back.